This is going to be the ultimate 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M2 Pro and M2 Max photography test. Let's find out how these machines perform against each other. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. A big thank you to all of you who have already subscribed to the channel. If you're new, welcome. Please consider subscribing because that will definitely help me out. I'll be sharing with you a lot of information, so please feel free to pause the video so you can analyze the result yourself, in addition to my analysis that I'll be sharing with you. I'll also leave timestamp below, so if you want to jump ahead, you can certainly do that. I've also created a new link to a tip jar, so if you find the information that I'm sharing with you on my channel helpful, please consider helping support the channel by using a tip jar. The funds will definitely go to just support me and my channel, and also it will go into a saving fund that I will use to purchase future machine to test in the studio as well. And with this in mind, let's take a look at our test system, which pretty much comprise the entire M2 Pro and entirely M2 Max lineup. Well, not entirely for every single chip, but essentially you can get an idea. So we have the variation between, for example, the base M2 Pro, the top M2 Pro, the base M2 Max, the top M2 Max, and I'm also throwing the result in for the top M1 Pro, top M1 Max, and also for kicks and giggles, I am throwing in the result from the M1 Ultra 48 GPU Max Studio as well. So that's going to be very interesting to see, and that will act as the anchor point. All these machines I'm testing right now are stock configuration with the exception of the 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Max chip. I have upgraded the memory from 32 to 64 gigabytes and the hard drive, or the SSD rather, from 1 terabyte to 2 terabyte. So let's quickly talk about test configurations because I get a lot of requests on this. Normally when I release a video, I would get a request saying that can you test a specific combination? What I would do is really extrapolate the data from the results from my test, because if you take a look at any of the charts, you will see I have the very top of the chart itself, what type of resources that specific task in the app is really using on the system. And I'll also share that in my analysis as well. So if you go through that, you can really extrapolate the data rather easily. For instance, upgrading from a 512 gigabyte SSD to a 1 terabyte, you're not really going to see that big of a time improvement when it comes to, for instance, Lightroom one-to-one rendering preview. So there's really not a lot I can do to really test that out, to really show any result difference, other than, for example, copy and reading write files to the hard drive. So those are just some things to think about. If you want to request that, please feel free to do so. But most of the time, because I already have so much resource invested into this, getting another machine is definitely going to start to hurt. All right, let's quickly talk about Apple SoC segmentation. So the chip, they have divided into two groups, more consumer leaning and more pro oriented. This is definitely the more pro oriented chip, and the timing for export and everything is definitely much shorter. And personally, I love testing more the pro oriented chip because I don't have to wait that long for the computer to finish the task. I mean, it was a painful process testing the M1 and M2 machines that were released not too long ago. And as usual, I'll be taking a pro photography and video approach to this. So that's the approach I'll be taking. The results you're going to be seeing are going to be from a single app testing. And the reason why I'm doing this instead of multitasking is because I really want to get a sole number on how the silicon is performing from one generation to the next and from one variant to the next variant of the silicon itself. All right, let's quickly talk about SSD. I want to mention that this is a component inside your machine that you can't upgrade, but there is a way to expand it once you get your machine. That would be via external hard drive, external SSD, and NAS, and there are other different things that you can do to the machine to gain or expand the storage space. You can't do it internally, but they all have to be done external, but it can be done. So when it comes to SSD configuration, my best recommendation for you is really think about how you are using SSD. Consider your need, consider your use case, and also your future use. Don't consider the SSD, or don't go and configure the SSD for speed, because that's not a good metric. You're going to be spending a lot of money to get a speed that may increase by quite a bit actually, but you're not really going to be utilizing or realizing the potential of that speed at all. So unless you really need more capacity, I wouldn't get more capacity just to get the higher speed. Now, something that I also want to point out is that for the 512 gigabyte SSD, we're looking at an SSD itself that can read or write at more than 3 gigabytes per second already. I can tell you right now that the apps doesn't really use sustain that much at all. The speed when you're really doing editing or anything like that. The only time you're going to see a difference, or maybe a difference, is when you're trying to copy files. However, if you're really just copying files like medias from your camera, you're not really going to see too much of a difference at all. So those are just some of the things to really think about. And I think that for majority of users, even for pros, it would be extremely hard for you to really go in and saturate that close to like 3.5 gigabytes per second read speed or write speed on the system. So those are just things to think about. And if you really want to know how fast of an SSD you really need or how much the program use, I'll leave a link to the video that I've created up here and also in the description below so you can take a look at that. The TLDR version is that majority of times when you're really doing photo editing or just editing in Final Cut Pro, you're looking at about 100 to 150 megabytes sustained, even on export. Sometimes it peaks up to like 3, maybe 400. That's the highest I was able to record it. And it's not based on the SSD speed, it's just based on the app utilization of the IOs on the computer in general. All right, let's talk about RAM. This is where we have to put some thought into it because we really need to think about the way how we use our computer and if this is going to be our singular machine or if this is going to be a supplemental mobile machine that will augment a desktop version of what you may have at your home office, at your home, or wherever that may be, or your studio, for instance. So if it's going to augment a desktop machine, you can configure it with less RAM because you just need to get some work done, but it doesn't have to be the fastest. If it's going to be your sole machine, then I would definitely configure more memory. This way you give your machine a little bit more opportunity. Even though you may not use it fully now, you may use it in the future, and that's really something to think about. Also consider the way how you are using your computer as well. For instance, if you're like me that has too many browsers and way too many tabs and multitask in so many different programs, then definitely get a computer with more RAM because that's definitely going to help you have a better using experience overall on your computer. One additional thing I want to share as well is a PSA for those of you coming from an Intel machine. Yes, these are unified memory inside the Apple New Silicon architecture, meaning that it is shared between the CPU and GPU. And yes, they are definitely fast memory. However, when you're configuring a machine, if on your Intel machine, for instance, you have 32 gigabytes of memory, I would keep the same 32 gigabytes instead of going down on the memory because you have to really think of this not from a faster memory perspective, but from the footprint that the apps that you're using to do the editing are already using. If you're already using that, you're going to still require the same amount of physical memory footprint as you have with the Intel machine. So those are things to think about. And another thing about RAM as well, unlike hard drive, there's really no way to expand it. You can't plug in an external RAM. So those are things to keep in mind. If you want to really figure out how you're going to use your RAM, you can always ask questions in the comment section below these videos. I'll answer them. I've been getting a lot of comments, so I may be a little bit slower, but I'll try my best to answer all of them. But if you really want to just determine this yourself, I would just launch Activity Monitor, do a restart in your system, and then start with the full workflow. As you go through the day, take a peek, go into the memory tab, and just take a look at the memory pressure. If it's green, you're good. If it's yellow or red, it probably tells you that the current memory that you have is not enough, and you may want to consider configuring your future machine with more memory. And if you're like me and you don't want to constantly take a peek at Activity Monitor, I use a program for this longest time ever called iStat Menu. It keeps track of everything that you do on the system. It tells you the result, and it also has this thing where it keeps track of what you're doing for around 30 days so you can really examine the way how you use your machine. I'll leave a link to their website in the description below. I'm not affiliated with them in any way at all, but I really love the app and the way how they have designed that. So in general, when it comes to RAM, I say that 32 gigabytes is a sweet spot for Pro because 16, when you start to use the Pro app, it can fill up really quickly. 32 is good that even though you may not use all of it, it allows you to grow into, but if you should use all of it, then it does give your system more room and more physical footprint of memory to run. And if you determine that you need more than that, if this is going to be your only machine, I mean, you can really configure these machines now up to 96 gigabyte of memory, which for a laptop is just absolutely insane. In a form factor that's not that much bigger than the previous generation. In fact, it is the same as the previous generation, 14 and 16 inch MacBook Pro. And you can do that on the 14-inch one also. I mean, that's just absolutely crazy. All right. So this is the way how I'm coding the specs that you're going to see in a chart. I'll leave a timestamp to this specific slide. If you want to come back and reference this in the future, you can. But first of all, let's take a look at Lightroom Classic. Everything has been retested in Ventura 13.2, running the latest release as it is filming, which is Lightroom Classic 12.1. All of the machines that I've tested support full hardware acceleration, and these are the results, just based on the testing chart that I have shared with you earlier. So what we're going to do though is make it a little bit easier to see. So let's arrange this from fastest to the slowest. Well, the fastest machine in this chart is the M1 Ultra. But interestingly enough, the M2 Max, M2 Pro, and M2 Max, all of these with a 12-core machine is starting to give the M1 Ultra a run for the money already when it comes to rendering one-to-one preview. And mind you, these are 1000 Nikon D850 RAW files. So it is doing quite a good job when it comes to this task. Now, as you start to go to the other chip, things start to trail down a little bit. For example, the M2 Pro, the base chip with 10 CPU, you can see that the timing itself is pretty much just the same as the top M1 Pro chip from the previous generation. I mean, it's about 30 seconds faster, but I would say that's close enough to each other. So that gives you an idea as far as how the program is performing. And interestingly enough, my M1 Max MacBook Pro is supposed to do a much better job in that, but that ended up dead last for some reason. All right. So this is exporting these 1000 Nikon D850 RAW file to a full-size JPEG. Let's rearrange this from fastest to slowest. Again, the M1 Ultra is beating all the machine. In fact, it's still 50% or more than 50% faster than any of these other machines in the lineup. So yes, even though the preview rendering, these new M2 Pros, M2 Max are really giving the M1 Ultra a run for the money. However, when it comes to export tasks, it's not just CPU anymore, it's using both CPU and GPU because Adobe have gone in and enabled hardware acceleration. When they say hardware acceleration, it just really means it's using the GPU on the system. So having more of those resources really attributed to a time improvement. What's interesting about all these results right now that you're seeing is that the M2 Pro is faster than the M2 Max in the test. So you can see that right there. And that's pretty much like the top M2 Pro. So it only has 19 GPU, but it's faster than the one with 38 GPU. So there's some wonkiness going on with the M2 Pro and M2 Max chip right now with Adobe software. As much as I've been running these tests, there are just some numbers that just, I would say, doesn't make a lot of sense at this moment. For example, the base M2 Pro is running like the slowest one right there, even though this chipset is supposed to be faster. So there are some resources utilization, especially if you go in and monitor the CPU and GPU, it's not really utilizing that really well because as I'm observing this, I'm finding out that there are many cores on multiple of these systems that, for example, the 2 efficiency cores are not being used at all. The high performance cores, some of them are only being tapped at like 50% instead of like 100%. Some of them are only at 70%. So that attributes a lot to the performance we're seeing right now, but that gives us a good idea. All right, let's take a look at Lightroom Classic HDR Merge. This is the result. Let's rearrange this a little bit from fastest to slowest. This is pretty much a CPU-based task, and for the most part, they are about the same, 3 seconds apart. Really no big deal from like the fastest to the slowest, and I'm not even worried about this at all. Now let's take a look at Lightroom Classic Panorama Merge. This is taking 14 Nikon D810 file, 36 megapixel, combining this into a 314 megapixel DNG file. For this, there are some variations. Let's rearrange it from fastest to slowest. So the M1 Ultra sits at the very top, and there's a couple of things that we can definitely glean from this chart. So if you do a lot of panorama merge, a couple of things to think about is to configure your machine with more memory, because as we start to increase the memory, you can see the time does decrease. This is the next cluster, and this cluster have 32 gigabyte. And the last cluster itself have 16 gigabytes of memory. This is the reason why I say that if you are a pro and you dabble in these tasks every now and then, 32 gigabytes is definitely going to give you the room necessary for you to really go do these tasks, but not really wait forever for these tasks to finish. Now, another thing I also want to point out as well is that if you do a lot more of these large files working, you may be better off instead of going for example, the latest M2 Max chip, you can definitely go with the M1 Max, but upgrade it to, for instance, like 64 gigabytes of memory. And that's already beating out the 2 M2 Max chip right there. So those are another considerations that you may want to think about as well. All right, let's take a look at Lightroom Cloud version. This is version 6.1 as it is filming, and all the machines support full hardware acceleration. This is the export time. So Lightroom Cloud version export utilize the system resources much different than, for instance, I would say Lightroom Classic. So it utilizes CPU, GPU, and also the RAM in its export, much more so than Lightroom Classic. Let's rearrange this from fastest to slowest. So in this program, the M1 Ultra is able to export these 1000 Nikon D850 files in under 3 minutes. That is super impressive. The next machine up is more than double the time for the M1 Ultra, and that is the M2 Max, the 1238. So that is the top M2 Max that is available. And one thing I'll tell you right now, that the RAM does matter, but not quite as much as we think. So this chart tells us a little bit about that too. For instance, the 64 sits at the very top there, but that's the one in the Ultra. But notice though that this one, the M2 Max, only have 32 gigabytes of memory, and the M1 Max with 64 is no longer performing that well. So this gives us an idea as far as how the spread goes. And memory is a factor, but it's not really a big factor. And we see a cluster up here of anything 32 and greater, and we see a cluster down here of 16 gigabyte memory. So this is, again, the reason why I recommend going to 32, because if a program can utilize it, it's going to give you more room to grow into. Let's now have a look at CaptureOne 23. This is version 16.0.2. So for this importing, I have generated a large preview. I have been told by one of my follower comments that CaptureOne is really designed as a tether capture program, and it's not really designed to do the task this way. This is why it doesn't really perform really well. However, I do think that CaptureOne in general have a problem with scaling. So let me rearrange this from fastest to slowest, and we'll see. M1 Ultra has more resources than any of the other machines in this chart, yet is only about a minute and 20 seconds faster than the M2 Pro. That tells you everything that you need to know about CaptureOne. Now, here's the thing. I can understand the fact that I'm really cranking up the preview and everything, and I appreciate the comments and everything like that. However, with CaptureOne wanting to market to bulk shooters like myself, events, wedding shooters, portrait shooters and everything, I really wish they have an option to trigger in a program so that I can choose high CPU performance and tether capture, so there is a balance that I can choose rather than just going with just a tether capture. I know the CaptureOne, like I said, is a tether capture program, but I'm also using it this way too, and this gives us a good idea for the performance. Now, a couple things to note about this chart is that when it comes to specifically importing files into CaptureOne, it's just CPU based only. It barely goes in and utilizes CPU, and RAM for the most part doesn't matter because we have 64 gigabyte sitting there at the very bottom of the chart and sitting there at the very top of the chart. So it doesn't really play too much of a variation at all. The number of cores, you can see that having more cores in general does benefit. So going from example like 10, 12, and 20, you can see it there. But it's just a minutia of performance improvement when you give more cores to CaptureOne. It doesn't really scale linearly in the way how we have expected to. This is CaptureOne export. So again, the same 1000 Nikon D850 file, exporting it to full-size JPEG. Let's rearrange from fastest to slowest. We can see, interestingly enough, that the M2 Max, the top chip, is outperforming the M1 Ultra by a little bit there. So this is very interesting. I wouldn't say that this is a call for concern for the M1 Ultra. It's just a very interesting result, the way how CaptureOne is going through all of this, because technically, really take a look at it. CaptureOne export utilizes GPU exclusively. That's what they call hardware acceleration. And this one still has way more GPU cores than that system, but is really not being tapped well at all. And this is the reason why, if you're using CaptureOne, I never recommend that you go out and buy, for example, the top spec M1 Max or the top spec M2 Max. I would say if you go, for example, with the base M1 Max or the base M2 Max, you're going to get a much better performance out of it while still gaining the advantage of the extra GPU on the system. So those are just some of the things to consider with CaptureOne. Having more memory, you can see that the memory cluster does show a difference as well right there. This is anything 32 or above, and you can start to see the timing start to trail a little bit when you have 16 gigabytes of memory. Again, more the reason why I highly encourage Pro get 32. Let's take a look at Photoshop performance, and for this one I am using Lloyd Chamber Digital Lloyd Test. I'll leave a link to his website in the description below. If you want to test this out yourself, you can. These are the 3 benchmarks that I'm running from his test, and you can pause the video to see what they do. But first, let's take a look at Photoshop speed. This is with 90% RAM allocation, and let's rearrange from fastest to slowest. We can see from this chart that they're only milliseconds apart. What this really translates to, even though the chart is cascading right now, for humans like you, like me, we're not going to notice a difference. This is using a computer to time the result, and that's the reason why we're seeing this cascade happening. Now, when we put in, for example, a file that's larger at 15.7 gigabyte, the story starts to change a little bit. Let's arrange from fastest to the slowest machine. Interestingly enough, the M2 with 32 gigabytes of memory is coming out at the very top, and this is pretty much, again, within a margin of error of each other, even though it looks like the chart's off by a little bit. I mean, again, these are just milliseconds, so to me and you, they're all pretty much the same. This one is definitely significantly longer because it's more than double the time. You're definitely going to feel that. So 16 gigabyte, again, the reason why you don't want to configure your machine at 16 gigabyte if you are a pro. Lastly, let's take a look at Photoshop Huge. This is 56 gigabyte, and I know there are some of you guys out there that use 56 because I have received comments and also DMs about some of you that are using these files. So here it is for you, and it's a good test on just the RAM on the system anyway. So this one, we can see a cluster clearly. 64 gigabytes of memory, doing really well. 32, trailing behind, but still respectable. And as we go to 16, things start to get a little bit weird. In fact, the 16 on the M1 Pro is running much faster than the M2 Pro and both of those chip configuration. So this is telling me a couple things. First of all, that these two, there's something going on with the result that's causing it to go that wonky, meaning that it's not optimized. The program is not really utilizing the silicon well at all. So this may be a test that we have to visit in a future version of Photoshop to see how it is doing. But that's just some of the things to think about. And you're going to see too that in the previous tests that I've shared, there's a lot of wonky result. Like the chip that's supposed to be faster, it's not really doing that much better than, for example, the base chip, especially comparing, for instance, the M2 Max, the base and the top configuration. We're supposed to see a top configuration like doing much better in certain tasks with Adobe products, but it's really not right now as of the current release that we have. Let's take a look at Final Cut Pro encoder decoder engine. Let's rearrange H.264 from fastest to slowest. Again, what you're seeing at the top there are machines that has double the encoder decoder engine compared to the Pro. This is why everything gets cut in half. In fact, the Macs also have double the encoder decoder engine compared to, in fact, the Ultra does have double the decoder encoder engine compared to the Max. However, the timing is just about the same, and that's pretty much all that we're going to be getting from the Ultra at this point in time. But if you are a video pro, I highly recommend considering at least a Max machine because the encoder decoder engine is definitely going to be a lifesaver for you. Because let's say you make a mistake on the edit, you have to go back, recut it again. Well, you can export that much faster and upload the work because, I mean, let's face it, I mean, uploading takes a lot of time, but you can cut the time that you have to re-encode that. That's definitely going to help with the workflow a lot. HEVC 8-bit, again, following the same trend. And if we take a look at Final Cut ProRes 422, let's rearrange that a little bit. We can see that the timing are fairly close to each other, although it doesn't really show a clear advantage. For example, the Max is sitting down here. So this is about the same on all of it because Apple have built in a specific ProRes encoder engine on all these chips as well, which makes it perform fairly well compared to all the other export. All right, so with that in mind, let's make sense of all of these data I just shared with you because that was a lot of information. So what I'm going to do first is speak to those of you who are going to be upgraders, specifically those of you who have already owned an Apple Silicon machine. And I'm going to talk to you guys who are Intel users in just a moment, but let's first talk to the Apple Silicon owners. You may want to consider upgrade, and there are so many different paths you can choose. For example, you can move up a chip, you can upgrade because you may need more RAM in your system. That I think is the more pressing issue, that you may have not configured it enough, but you do need more RAM, and this would be definitely a great time to upgrade. Or you need more SSD. Even though SSD, you can expand it with external storage, although to some, they just prefer to have internal storage. So those are things to think about. So I have created this chart as like the upgrade path that you can use for upgraders. And these are like the most logical decisions. So what you can do is just pause this video. Whatever chip you have right now, just put yourself on that chip. Let's say, for instance, I have the M1 Pro. Well, there's a couple of ways I can do. I definitely don't want to go back to the M1, so that's definitely not going to be the way to do it. Or I don't really want to go back to the M2 either, so we're not going to do that. So with this one, you have the option to scale laterally, for example, to the M1 Max. That will gain you more GPU on the system, and depending on the configuration you have, you may also get more CPU as well, and you can also get access to more RAM on the system. If you want the ultimate performance right now, the Ultra sits at the very top. There's no arrow going anywhere. And every arrow technically just really leads to the Ultra. In fact, I'll also point that arrow up there as well. So those are just things to think about. Now, if you currently have, for instance, like the M2, I'll also point out one more thing as well, that you can certainly choose to go back to the previous generation, but I wouldn't necessarily go to the Pro. So for instance, if you have the M2, and because, for example, the M1 generations are now being discontinued, prices are dropping, you can either get them refurb at a higher spec for a really great deal, or you can buy them used on the market. You may want to actually consider getting, instead of just like the upgrade to the M2 Pro or the M2 Max, you can certainly choose to go, for example, to the M1 Max and get a really great deal and performance that are still going to hold on its own just fine. So those are just some of the things to consider, and there are many upgrade paths that you can choose when you have already an Apple Silicon. So most of the time, I think that all of us are either going to be sitting at the M1, M2, or anything in this M1 lineup at the very top there. So hopefully this helped guide our decision a little bit. How should we upgrade? But like I said before, it's not a bad idea to just laterally upgrade the system rather than moving to the next generation as well, especially if you can configure an equivalent price machine with more RAM on the system, for instance, or an even cheaper price machine with even more RAM on the system, because you can see the performance gain. They're only just minutes apart with thousands of raw files being thrown at it. That really puts everything into perspective. As far as speed improvement goes, yes, there is, but as far as how much is it really going to matter when you have the machine, maybe not that much at all. All right, for you guys who are upgraders from Intel Mac, you have like almost a free-for-all. You can pretty much choose anything. And for those of you that are new Mac purchasers, I have created a graph that is a good, I would say, graphical recommendation as far as how you can choose your machine. So for Intels, and for those of you that are new to Mac, I have broken this down by task. So Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, Photoshop, CaptureOne, and Final Cut Pro. And I have broken down the chip into good, better, and best, so as you go down the list that way. So let's take a look first with Lightroom, Lightroom Classic. If you want a good chip, M1 Pro is definitely a good, stable chip, but if you want to get better performance, either go with the M1 Max, M2 Max, or the M1 Ultra. Photoshop, you don't really need the Ultra for that. You just need more RAM on the system in general. So configuring Photoshop usage with more RAM is going to help. If you're using CaptureOne, I definitely recommend getting a Max machine in general, because CaptureOne has a tendency to utilize GPU on the system. However, what I would do is get the base M1 Max machine or the M2 Max machine, the base Max chip, and not the upgraded chip, because the upgraded chip CaptureOne has never been able to utilize anyway. It's just pretty much wasted potential at that point. If you're doing video, I recommend getting the Max or the Ultra just because of the encoder-decoder engine. That's definitely going to help you go through the workflow a lot. As far as RAM go, minimum 16, although, I mean, for anything pro workflow wise, I would say an optimal is 32 plus. So depending on the type of file you work with, this is something that you can really glean from the charts I've shared. If you constantly work with large files, if your raw files are really huge and you export them into Photoshop, then I would consider getting more RAM on your system, or at least 32 at the very minimum. As far as SSD goes, really configure this based on your needs. 512 would be the minimum, and they're pretty much the minimum for all these machines anyway. In general, I recommend 1 terabyte because that gives you more room to grow into the system, and you also have extra space to store things on your system as well, in addition to getting a little bit of a speed boost, even though, like I said, that doesn't matter. So really choose the SSD size just based on your workflow. And that is about it. So we are now at an age where we have to configure our computer based on the workflow and what we do most on our computers. And what I would really do is examine the app that you use, and through my videos, really look at the system resources that are being used in those specific tasks inside those applications. This will give you a good insight into configuring your machine in the future as well, because this is a good fundamental for you to have. The days of really going out there and really spending a lot of money upgrading everything to top specs, I mean, you can certainly choose to do that, but there are a lot of resources on that machine that you may not be utilizing at all. And that may not be the best way to spend the money possible. And as we know, if we start to configure our machine to like the top spec on everything, it can be a $10,000 laptop by the time we're done with everything. Yet we're not even going to use half of that. So the best thing that we can do is really understand what we're doing, really think about what you use the machine to do most, and configure your computer based on the workflow and the tasks that you're going to be using that computer for. Chances are, most of the time, if you configure for that task and there's other things that you do, some of those configuration that you upgrade to will also overlap into the other creative tasks that you have as well. But I'll also be here on my channel and sharing you these guides going forward as well, so you can always use me as a resource. Anyway, I hope that you find this information helpful. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit on the bell if you're new, and in art we trust.